Silverpod Reads here. This is Chapter 11, Part 2. It's going to be a little bit short because I thought I had a lot more story to read, but apparently I don't. Let's get started. Elsewhere, deep in the forest in an old dilapidated house, dinner was the last thing the 13-year-old boy had on his mind where he sat on the bathroom floor, holding his right hand over his bleeding left wrist. Salmon thought it was strange how Chuck had been so kind to him last night and let him stay over at Sam's place. It appeared Chuck had plans that night. When Spike had asked, Chuck had snarled it was none of his business. However, revealed he'd been meeting a man, one Chuck had called a colleague. He'd been in a strange mood when Spike came home from school. He was acting almost like he did when he was drunk, except that he hadn't been drinking. He was angry, and even the slightest thing would piss him off, and he denied everything Spike said, including having him let Spike stay at his friend's house. Chuck asked Spike all kinds of questions about his friend, and when he didn't get any answers, he beat his young nephew to a pulp. Spike glanced through tear-wet eyes at his uncle's razor blade where it lay by his feet. It made him think of his suicide attempt and why he had done it. Everyone I've met or been told of, he thought of himself. They've all thought life is a beautiful thing. Even if they've been on the edge of a rooftop, ready to jump, they've suddenly come to think of something about life that makes it worth living after all. A new warm tear ran down his face. I, however, just can't find beauty in life at all. Nothing in it that makes it worth living. What I've had can't be called a life. It feels like I've been dead ever since I was born. So what point is there in living when I've got nothing to live for? What kind of future is there for someone like me? The door Spike was leaning against started shaking as someone pounded on it. "Spike!" his uncle roared. "Spike, what the hell are you doing in there?" Spike took a deep breath and then shouted back. "Leave me alone, you fucking son of a bitch!" Dead silence followed for a brief second. Spike's heart skipped a beat instantly, and instinctively experiencing fear from having cursed at his uncle, knowing what the consequences would be. But he didn't care, not this time. He was hopefully going to bleed to death anyway, so why would he be afraid of his uncle now? "How dare you talk to me like that?" Spike shouted. "Open the door, Spike! I'm gonna beat the hell out of you!" To Chuck's great surprise, he heard Spike turn around the key, unlocking the door. Chuck ripped it open and stared right into his pair of dark green eyes. Spike stared hard at him, staring furiously, still trying best to hold back his fear. Chuck finally noticed blood dripping from Spike's clenched fist, then the razor blade on the blood-stained floor. "What are you doing, you little shit?" "I'm putting an end to all of this," Spike replied solemn. "Oh, so you're killing yourself, is that it?" Spike said and added a laugh. "Yeah, and why do you care?" Spike yelled. "You want me dead anyways." "Well, go ahead then, die!" Chuck yelled back with outstretched arms. "You're so pathetic, you can't even cut a bigger artery. The one in your wrist doesn't kill you, not the way you've cut it, you cowardly fuck. Slice your stomach open, stab your heart, or hey, how about this, use a goddamn gun." He stopped himself there, noticing how Spike was getting dizzy, and had to lean against the sink before he dropped down to sitting. Chuck looked at Spike where he held his hand tight around his wrist and breathed heavily, sweat trickling down his face. Chuck sighed. "You dumb child," he said with a suddenly milder voice, then he quickly took off his belt. Spike was at first expecting Chuck to hit him with the belt, but instead his uncle knelt down beside him and strapped the belt tight around his arm right above his bleeding wrist. "Why are you helping me?" Spike carefully asked. For a moment, Chuck looked as though he was about to say something comforting, or at least something that was nicer than he would normally say. He glanced up at Spike, actually seeming a tad worried, like he was, even for just a second, regretting some of the things he'd done that led to Spike's suicide attempt. Just then, Chuck suddenly started saying, "I'm not a necrophile, kid. I need to keep you alive." Spike glared at him. "I fucking hate you." "Hey, watch it, brat. As soon as this wound stops bleeding, you're in for a beating." Chuck stood up and went to the cupboard by the sink and searching for some cotton, Band-Aid, or anything useful. He soon gave up and started looking around. By the filthy toilet, he noticed the soon empty roll of toilet paper. "That'll do," he murmured to himself. Spike watched his uncle walk back over to him. "Can you stand?" Chuck asked. Spike shook his head. "Here, kid," Chuck then said, and placed Spike's arm around his neck, holding him around the waist. "I'll help you up." Spike was led over to the sink where Chuck cleaned his wound with water. Spike was surprised by his uncle's sudden kindness. It reminded him of when he was a kid and he was brought to his uncle's house for the first time. In the beginning, Chuck was being so nice to Spike, and even though he was just 5 years old at the time, he started feeling like Chuck could be the father he'd never had. But that was before the abuse started. Still, Chuck had shown him many times that he could in fact be a nice guy when he felt like it, and they'd been such great friends when Spike was little. This was all very confusing and had led Spike to question innumerable times whether he really did hate his uncle, or if there was actually some feeling left there. Feelings that he somehow actually loved his uncle. Because of the way he'd been treated that time, looking into Chuck's eyes right now, Spike thought he could see traces of a kind man he'd once been. When did it all go wrong? What had happened? Was it Spike's fault his uncles did those things? Spike thought he knew the answer to those things, and it all went wrong suddenly one rainy night not far from Spike's 6th birthday. He was so young, so he didn't know exactly what happened to make his uncle do those things, but he knew it was his own fault somehow. Chuck wrapped Spike's wrist in toilet paper and helped him get back into his room, saying Spike needed to rest. Spike sat down on the bedside. He glanced up at his uncle and decided to ask before he left. "Uncle?" "Yeah, what?" Chuck asked. Spike hesitated. Then he finally asked what he'd been asking for so many times before, but never really gotten a good answer to. "Why are you doing those things to me?" Chuck's serious face expression changed to a more surprised one. "What things? Beats you? You know the answer to that." No, I mean the other things, the things I don't want you to do. Why do you keep doing it?" "Dear boy," Chuck said and shook his head and then sat down on his bed right beside Spike. "Don't come and say you don't like those things. I know you do." "But I don't, honest," Spike carefully protested. "Oh, really? Because the way I see it, there's a part of you that clearly shows it enjoys it while we're at it, so don't lie to me, Spike. You're enjoying the things we do, and you know that so well." Spike wanted to say something, deny that Chuck was claiming to know, but he wanted to get an answer for the question. Instead, he repeated it. "Persistent little bugger, aren't you?" His uncle grinned. "Well, you see, Spike, there are several reasons why I do it. Reasons you may or may not understand." "Could you mention one of those reasons?" Spike asked. Chuck sighed, and his gaze descended. Spike waited, and he looked at his uncle's eyes, again noticing how his cold eyes looked with those icy blue irises. Chuck always said he hated Spike's eyes, but Spike couldn't exactly make himself say he was any fonder of Chuck's either. They scared him. It was as if though his body froze in an instant, whatever his eyes meant. "You wanted a reason, Spike?" Chuck started speaking in a low-toned voice. Spike nodded and waited as Chuck paused again. "I do it," he began, looking in Spike's eyes. "I do it," he repeated, "because I love you." Spike's eyes widened, mostly in confusion. "I told you wouldn't understand," Chuck said and stood up from the bed. Didn't look at Spike anymore, as though he's ashamed or maybe embarrassed. "I'll leave you alone now so you can rest for a bit. Gather your strength." "You're not going to beat me like you said?" Spike asked, puzzled by Chuck's sudden change of behavior. "No," Chuck replied softly, "not today." Then he walked out the door and closed it after him without locking it this time. Spike lay down on the bed with his left arm resting on his stomach, the other behind his head. He looked up at the ceiling and thought about what his uncle said. "He loves me?" Spike thought. "He's sure got a strange way of showing it. If those things he does is what love is, then I don't want to be loved." Spike noticed he was still feeling dizzy. It felt as though the bed was rocking beneath him and the roof was swirling. He shook his head, but it only made it ache, so he decided to follow his uncle's surprisingly kind advice and get some rest.